A little over a year ago, I went out to dinner with my friend's family for the first time. I had been in America for a few months. Upon introduction of myself as Nigerian, the first question out her mom's mouth was, "How far did you have to walk from your village to your school every day?" I found this question especially bizarre because I had never walked to school before, nor did I live in a village. So it took me a few seconds to process and register my answer to the question. When I finally found my tongue, I'd said something along the lines of, I boarded the school bus to school every day, sounding just as unsure of myself as the look of surprise that crept across her face when she got my answer, even though I was telling the truth. What I find most fascinating about this till date, though, is the fact that this woman, my friend's mom, who had no idea who I was, knew nothing about me except my name and that I was friends with her daughter, could come to such a drastic conclusion that I lived in a village or walked to school every day based on the mere fact that I was from Nigeria, or from Africa, as it's usually put. This was the first time I had been caught off guard by such a question as regards where I was from. But it surely wasn't the last, as over the next few months, I found myself in conversations where I had to answer questions like, are you poor? Is your family too happy to realize how poor you are? Do they have cars in Africa? Do you know how there's no internet and there's no power in Africa? Other times I listen to people say things like, oh, I'm gonna visit Africa or Cuba. Or flight attendants talk about their routes through Japan, China, or Africa, regardless of the fact that Africa is a continent and all those other places were countries. Although I tried to make an argument for my continent when I could, it was never truly enough, as I remained continually haunted by the inaccuracy of the perceptions people had of where I was from. And so my journey began. The frantic search for answers to questions about where I was from. The first question being, what do people really think about Africa? Or what image comes to mind when you hear Africa? In a bid to find the most random sample of people with different perspectives and from different ways of life, I constantly looked up answers to this question, asked people in person whenever I got the chance, and put up multiple Quora posts to get their answers. The most popular answers were abundant wildlife, poverty, disease, beautiful landscape, Black people, AIDS, and starving children. Sadly, for the vast majority of people, this is all they see when they think of Africa. Not the second largest continent in the world whose land size fits the entirety of Europe and two of the largest countries in the world in the United States and China. Not the 54 different countries in Africa. Not the 1.2 billion people, a seventh of the world's population, who lives in Africa, but rather a huge lump of people defined by one truth, regardless of the fact that two Africans are more genetically different from each other than a person of Chinese descent is from a person of European descent. The bigger question, though, is what drives these notions? For quite a number of people, their narratives of Africa are loosely but solely based on the media. TV commercials, the news, and Hollywood movies like The Lion King or Hotel Rwanda. For some others, their narratives of Africa is based on the coup of an African country they've discussed in a history class they took, or the relief trips they've taken to poor villages in countries like Mauritania, Togo, or Ghana. While these depictions from the movies, the visits, and the history classes are accurate, they do not do enough justice of this huge continent to create a concrete universal narrative of it, thus leading us to create something called a single-story notion of African countries. So, what is a single-story notion? A single-story notion is a judgment or hasty generalization we make about a people or a community based on stories we've heard, seen, or learned, even though the stories might contain limited information or may be incomplete. An example of a single story would be, I once visited Welch County, Colorado. I stayed with my friend Kevin Fry on his farm. Kevin and a lot of people in the community owned a lot of cows, owned large acres of lands for farm, and enjoyed a good cow auction. I realized that North Americans owned large acres of land, big cornfields, and had fun at a good cow auction. Yeah, it's a little outrageous, but. On the flip side of it, a single-storied notion could also be, I visited Manhattan, New York once. I decided and realized that North Americans lived in big cities with skyscrapers and chose to walk, ride their bikes, or take the subway rather than drive because traffic is too hectic. For my friend's mom, though, her single-storied notion was that to be from an African country, you needed to live in a village. And to be educated from an African country, you had to walk to school on a daily basis. Although single-storied notions can come in positives and negatives, African countries have often gotten the shorter end of the stick with negative views because the biggest influencer of Africa's narratives in the media and the school system tend to focus only on the juicy stuff. Only the extremes, the misfortunes, and the terrors get reported on TV or made into movies, which is understandable, by the way. I mean, no one wants to listen to a reporter talk about the Kenyan with a steady 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. job to earn a living. Or the Ghanaian communities with steady electricity or steady water supply. But I do think it is important to note that while these things might not be newsworthy, they're not non-existent. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to be overly critical of anyone. Frankly, I am in no position to because I am just as, if not more, guilty of making hasty generalizations of places based on single stories. Nevertheless, I do think it is important for us to become more aware of how inappropriate it is to define a whole group of people based on one history class, one story, one movie, or even one visit. Don't get me wrong. To say that stereotypes and narratives are incorrect would be improper and overly inaccurate. But the biggest drawback with stereotypes is that they tend to be incomplete and often highlight our differences rather than our similarities. Let's prove this notion real quick. Take, for example, the wildlife and safaris of Africa. By a quick show of hands, how many people think of lions, zebras, elephants, and giraffes when you think of Africa? Yeah? Yeah, because it's supposed to be a diverse ecosystem, right? It's like one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world, right? But how come we never talk about the West African countries like Togo, Ghana, Nigeria, where people have to visit zoos to actually see wildlife? I mean, where they don't have lions roaming around the street or zebras walking across the street. Why? Because these people are too similar to us? I mean, also, we talk about poverty, diseases, lack of running water, lack of electricity in African countries, but we never talk about the families that have steady electricity, access to clean water, health insurance, and can afford to go on vacation in the Bahamas. Why? Because they are too similar to us? Although the majority of our learning tools, like the school system and the media, tend to pick out and emphasize our differences rather than our similarities, it really is up to us as individuals to educate ourselves on unfamiliar territories, especially since we live in a world where information is so easily accessible. So, be it on the subject of Africa, or be it on a broader scale on subjects involving the judgment of other people's races, religions, sexuality, or social backgrounds, it is imperative that we do not rely on just narratives, but rather on the complete story to make an informed judgment. While I'm not trying to gloss over the existence of negatives in African countries, like the idea that 38% of people in African countries live under the poverty line, or that one child dies of malaria every 30 seconds, and 90% of the mortality rate occurs in Africa, I just think it is important to note the entirety of the story and not just a single part of it. Someone might say, I'm entitled to my own opinion. I can say whatever I want. I am of the belief that we are not entitled to our opinions, but we are entitled to our informed opinions, as no one is entitled to be ignorant. So, next time you want to tell your friend about the visit to a poor village in Guinea-Bissau and want to say Africa, think of the 54 different countries, 3,000 different ethnicities, and 2,000 different languages you're going to lump together into a group and expect this small village to represent. What next you want to say, why is Africa so poor, or why do they still live off handoffs? Think about the 1 in 3 Africans that are actually middle class. When next you want to discuss the foreign aid that's preventing Africa from its impending doom, realize that foreign aid represents only 2% of the GDP of African countries, and that Africans abroad send $8 million more to their families at home annually than the entire world sends to African countries in foreign aid on a yearly basis. Finally, when you want to say, Africa is so backwards, or why do all Africans live in huts? Think of cities like Kigali, Rwanda, Casablanca, Morocco, Johannesburg, South Africa, and Lagos, Nigeria, to name a few, who match up infrastructurally with some of the biggest cities in the world. In the words of Ryszard Kapuscinski on Africa, the continent is too large to describe. It is a veritable ocean, a separate planet, a varied, immensely rich cosmos. Only with the greatest simplification, for the sake of convenience, can we say Africa. In reality, except as a geographical appellation, Africa does not exist. Thank you.